Portland, Oregon, March 17, 1986. The morning air carried the dampness typical of early spring in the Pacific Northwest, as regular customers began gathering outside Mitchell's Quilts on Southeast Hawthorne Boulevard. The small shop, nestled between a bookstore and a vintage clothing boutique, had become a beloved fixture in the neighborhood over the past 8 years. Sarah Mitchell, the 38-year-old proprietor, had built a reputation for punctuality that rivaled the precision of her needlework. Every morning at precisely 8 o'clock, she would unlock the front door, flip the hand-painted wooden sign to "Open," and begin her day surrounded by walls adorned with intricate textile creations. But on this particular Monday morning, the door remained locked, the sign unmoved. "So glad to have you here. Comment your city so I can bring cases from your region and also know where you're watching me from." By noon, concerned patrons had contacted the Portland Police Bureau. Officers arrived at the modest storefront to find everything seemingly in order from the outside. No broken windows, no signs of forced entry, nothing to suggest anything amiss. But when building management provided access, investigators stepped into a scene that would puzzle them for decades to come. Inside, the shop appeared frozen in time. A half-finished quilt lay stretched across the large work table in the center of the room, needles still threaded with colored cotton. 2 teacups sat on the front counter, one still containing liquid that had long grown cold. Sarah's leather handbag hung on its usual hook near the back entrance, her wallet and identification still inside. The cash register held the previous week's receipts, untouched. Detective Robert Anderson, a 15-year veteran of the department, conducted initial interviews with neighbors and regular customers. Everyone described Sarah as reliable, kind, and deeply devoted to her craft. She had been widowed 5 years earlier when her husband died in a construction accident, leaving her childless and alone. The quilt shop had become her entire world, a sanctuary where she taught evening classes and welcomed a steady stream of enthusiasts eager to learn traditional textile arts. The last confirmed sighting placed Sarah in her shop on Sunday afternoon. A neighboring business owner recalled seeing lights on in Mitchell's Quilts around 6 in the evening, unusual for a Sunday but not unprecedented. Sarah often worked late when inspired by a new project. As investigators documented the scene, Detective Anderson studied the unfinished quilt on the work table. Something about its pattern struck him as peculiar. Sarah was known for traditional designs, classic patterns passed down through generations of quilters. But this piece featured an arrangement of geometric shapes and color combinations he had never seen in any of her previous work. The pattern seemed almost deliberate in its complexity, as though each square had been carefully planned according to some invisible blueprint. The detective photographed every angle of the workspace, paying particular attention to this unusual quilt. He had no way of knowing that this textile, with its seemingly random arrangement of fabrics, would hold the key to a mystery that would remain unsolved for 37 years. As the first day of investigation drew to a close, one fact became increasingly clear. Sarah Mitchell had not simply walked away from her life. Everything she valued remained exactly where she had left it. But Sarah herself had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only the silent testimony of an unfinished quilt whose secrets would not be revealed for more than 3 decades. The initial 48 hours following Sarah Mitchell's disappearance proved crucial, yet ultimately frustrating for investigators. Detective Anderson expanded his inquiry beyond the immediate vicinity of the quilt shop, determined to understand every facet of Sarah's life that might explain her sudden absence. Bank records revealed something unexpected. Over the 3 weeks prior to her disappearance, Sarah had made 4 cash withdrawals totaling $3,000, substantial amounts that deviated from her normally modest spending patterns. The transactions occurred at different branches throughout Portland, almost as if she had been deliberately avoiding a pattern. Yet her account still held adequate funds, suggesting she had not been preparing for a planned departure. Interviews with students from her quilting classes painted a picture of a woman who had seemed increasingly preoccupied in recent weeks. Several mentioned that Sarah had spoken about working on something important, a special project she described as different from anything she had attempted before. When pressed for details, she had simply smiled and changed the subject. One student recalled Sarah saying that quilts could tell stories that words could not, an observation that seemed innocuous at the time, but would later take on profound significance. The investigation took an interesting turn when Detective Anderson obtained access to Sarah's home, a modest bungalow she had shared with her late husband. In her bedroom, investigators found a personal journal dating back several years. The entries were sporadic, mostly documenting her daily activities and thoughts about quilt designs. But the final entries, written in the weeks before her disappearance, contained cryptic references that caught Anderson's attention. Sarah had written about patterns that preserve truth and stitching secrets into permanence. She mentioned feeling watched and expressed concern about knowing too much. The entry stopped abruptly 2 weeks before she vanished, as though she had decided the journal itself had become unsafe. The basement of the quilt shop yielded another discovery. Behind boxes of fabric and supplies, investigators found dozens of completed quilts, each carefully wrapped in protective cloth and labeled with dates spanning back to 1982. Sarah had created a meticulous catalog system, photographing each quilt from multiple angles and maintaining detailed notes about the patterns, colors, and techniques used. The collection represented hundreds of hours of work, yet Sarah had never displayed these pieces in her shop or offered them for sale. Detective Anderson spent hours examining the photographs, searching for anything that might explain their significance. Each quilt featured complex geometric patterns, some traditional, others entirely unique. The color combinations varied wildly, from somber earth tones to vibrant primary colors. To the untrained eye, they appeared to be simply the artistic output of a dedicated craftsperson. But something about their systematic organization suggested they represented more than mere artwork. Investigators also discovered that Sarah had been in contact with a local attorney 3 months before her disappearance. The lawyer, when questioned, revealed that Sarah had inquired about witness protection programs and what legal options existed for someone who had inadvertently obtained information about criminal activity. She had been vague about specifics, and when the attorney pressed for details, Sarah had thanked him and left without pursuing the matter further. As weeks turned into months with no new leads, the case began to grow cold. Detective Anderson continued to follow up on occasional tips, but none led anywhere substantial. The prevailing theory suggested Sarah had been the victim of a random crime, though the complete absence of physical evidence made this difficult to prove. The quilt shop was eventually cleared and sold to a new owner. Sarah's personal effects were distributed to distant relatives who had little connection to her life in Portland. The mysterious quilts from the basement were donated to various textile museums and historical societies, where they were cataloged as examples of late 20th century American folk art. But Detective Anderson kept copies of all the photographs, particularly those of the unfinished quilt from Sarah's work table. Something about those patterns continued to nag at him, a puzzle he could not quite solve. He filed them away in his personal records, unable to shake the feeling that Sarah Mitchell had left behind a message, if only someone could learn to read it. The years following Sarah Mitchell's disappearance brought little closure to those who had known her. By 1990, the Portland Police Bureau officially classified her case as cold, filing it among hundreds of other unsolved disappearances that haunted the department's archives. Detective Robert Anderson retired in 1998, taking with him copies of the quilt photographs that had occupied so many of his thoughts over the years. The Mitchells' quilt storefront changed hands 3 times over the next 2 decades. Each new owner attempted to capture the charm that Sarah had created, but none achieved the same connection with the community. By 2005, the space had been converted into a coffee shop, and the neighborhood's collective memory of the gentle woman who had once taught quilting classes there began to fade. Sarah's quilts, meanwhile, found new homes in unexpected places. The Portland Historical Society acquired 6 pieces for their textile collection. 3 more went to a museum in Eugene, focusing on Oregon craft traditions. Several ended up in the hands of private collectors who appreciated the technical skill evident in every stitch, completely unaware of any connection to an unsolved missing person case. In 2010, a regional exhibition titled Pacific Northwest Textile Arts 1975-2000 featured 2 of Sarah's quilts. The accompanying catalog included a brief mention of her disappearance, framing it as a tragic footnote to an otherwise unremarkable artistic career. The exhibition drew modest attendance and generated no new leads in the case. The landscape of criminal investigation was changing during these years. DNA analysis became more sophisticated. Digital databases allowed departments across the country to share information about unsolved cases. Cold case units began re-examining decades-old evidence with fresh eyes and new technology. Yet Sarah Mitchell's case remained untouched, lacking the physical evidence that might benefit from these advances. A shift began in 2018 when academic researchers started publishing work about the historical use of textiles as communication tools. Studies explored how enslaved people in the 19th century had allegedly used quilt patterns as maps and signals for the Underground Railroad. While some historians disputed these claims, the research sparked renewed interest in the idea that fabric and thread could convey information beyond mere decoration. Detective Anderson, now 73 years old and living in retirement on the Oregon coast, followed these developments with growing interest. He had never been able to forget Sarah Mitchell or the peculiar quilts she had left behind. The new research awakened something in him, a suspicion that had lingered for decades, but which he had never been able to articulate clearly. In the spring of 2023, Anderson made a decision. He contacted the Portland Police Bureau and requested that they share the case files with an expert in textile history and pattern analysis. The department, with little to lose on a case that had been cold for 37 years, agreed to the request. Through connections at Portland State University, Anderson was directed to Dr. Jennifer Hayes, a 45-year-old professor whose specialty lay at the intersection of art history, mathematics, and cryptography. Her research focused on how patterns in textiles, pottery, and other crafts throughout history had sometimes served purposes beyond aesthetics, encoding information in arrangements of shapes and colors that appeared random to casual observers. Dr. Hayes received the case files in June 2023. The package contained police reports, witness statements, and most importantly, high-resolution photographs of Sarah Mitchell's quilts, including detailed images of the unfinished piece found on her work table the day she disappeared. Hayes spent the first week simply studying the images, allowing her trained eye to absorb the patterns without immediately attempting interpretation. What she began to notice sent a chill down her spine. The quilts were not random at all. Each one followed internal logic that became more apparent the longer she studied them. The arrangement of colors, the positioning of geometric shapes, the very choice of which traditional patterns to use and which to avoid, all of it suggested deliberate construction according to a system. Sarah Mitchell had not been creating art for art's sake. She had been building something else entirely, something that would wait in plain sight for nearly 4 decades before anyone recognized it for what it was. Dr. Hayes reached for her phone to call Detective Anderson. The quilts were speaking, and she was beginning to understand their language. Dr. Jennifer Hayes converted her university office into a makeshift investigation center during the summer of 2023. Every wall became covered with enlarged photographs of Sarah Mitchell's quilts. Color-coded strings connected common elements across different pieces. Spreadsheets tracked the frequency of specific patterns, hues, and geometric arrangements. What emerged from this analysis would rewrite the understanding of an unsolved case and reveal the remarkable courage of a woman who had found a way to speak from beyond the grave. The breakthrough came from the unfinished quilt, the last piece Sarah had been working on when she vanished. Hayes noticed that certain fabric squares contained an unusual number of stitches, far more than necessary for structural integrity. When she counted these stitches and assigned numerical values based on their positions, coordinates emerged. Latitude and longitude, precise enough to identify a specific location in rural Clackamas County, approximately 30 miles southeast of Portland. This discovery unlocked the rest of the system. Sarah had developed a sophisticated encoding method that blended traditional quilting patterns with her own innovations. Colors represented categories of information. Red fabrics indicated financial transactions. Blue suggested locations. Green marked dates. The geometric patterns themselves, stars, diamonds, log cabin blocks, each carried meaning when placed in specific relationships to one another. Hayes worked backward through the collection chronologically, starting with the quilts from 1986 and moving toward earlier pieces. A narrative began to emerge, one that explained everything about Sarah Mitchell's final weeks and the danger she had faced. The quilts documented a complex criminal operation involving real estate fraud and money laundering that had been active in Portland throughout the mid-1980s. The encoded information revealed that Sarah had not always been a quilt shop owner. Prior to opening Mitchell's Quilts in 1978, she had worked as a bookkeeper and financial manager for several small businesses in Portland. One of her clients had been a property development company owned by a man named Thomas Wright, a prominent local businessman involved in commercial real estate. According to the patterns Hayes decoded, Sarah had discovered irregularities in Wright's business dealings in late 1985. Money was being moved through shell corporations. Properties were being bought and sold at artificial prices to obscure the true flow of funds. The operation involved multiple partners, all respected members of Portland's business community, making any accusation dangerous for someone in Sarah's position. The quilts showed that Sarah had initially tried to extract herself quietly from the situation. She resigned from her bookkeeping position in January 1986, citing a desire to focus entirely on her textile work. But she had made the fatal error of keeping copies of financial documents, apparently as insurance against potential retaliation. The quilts documented where she had hidden these papers and recorded specific details about transactions that could prove the criminal conspiracy. Hayes discovered that Sarah had used her quilting to create an alternative form of documentation, one that could exist openly without arousing suspicion. Who would think to look for evidence of financial crimes in decorative textiles? The system was brilliant in its simplicity and devastating in its implications. Sarah Mitchell had known she was in danger. She had created these quilts as a form of protection, a way to ensure the truth would survive even if she did not. The most chilling revelation came from analyzing the sequence of quilts created in February and March 1986. The patterns showed increasing urgency. Sarah had recorded a meeting with Wright on March 10th. She had documented an argument, encoded as a specific arrangement of conflicting patterns. The final quilt, left unfinished on her work table, contained coordinates, a date, March 16th, 1986, and a pattern that Hayes had learned represented a plea for help that had gone unheard for 37 years. Hayes compiled her findings into a comprehensive report and contacted Detective Anderson. Together, they approached the Portland Police Bureau with evidence that demanded immediate action. The coordinates from Sarah's final quilt pointed to a specific property, an old farmstead that had been abandoned for decades, but which, in 1986, had been owned by Thomas Wright's development company. Authorization for a search warrant was expedited given the circumstances. As investigators prepared to excavate the location identified in Sarah Mitchell's textile testimony, one question dominated everyone's thoughts. What else would they find buried at the site where a frightened woman had left coordinates stitched into fabric, a message in thread that had waited nearly 4 decades to be read? The excavation was scheduled for late August 2023, and the truth that would emerge from the earth would prove even more devastating than the secrets hidden in the quilts. August 24, 2023, Clackamas County, Oregon. The abandoned farmstead sat isolated among overgrown fields and deteriorating outbuildings, exactly as the coordinates from Sarah Mitchell's quilt had indicated. A forensic team assembled at dawn, equipped with ground-penetrating radar and excavation tools. Detective Anderson, now 73, stood at the perimeter alongside Dr. Jennifer Hayes, both understanding that they were about to confirm what the decoded quilts had already revealed. The property records told their own story. In 1986, the land had belonged to Wright Development Corporation, one of several holdings in Thomas Wright's commercial real estate portfolio. The farmhouse had been condemned in 1984, and the property had remained unused, eventually passing through multiple ownership changes over the decades. By 2023, it belonged to a timber company that had never developed the land. Ground-penetrating radar identified 2 anomalies beneath what had once been a barn foundation. The first excavation site was marked, and investigators began the careful process of removing soil layer by layer. Within 3 hours, they uncovered a metal container approximately 2 feet below the surface. The box, protected by heavy plastic sheeting, had survived nearly 4 decades underground, relatively intact. Inside, investigators found exactly what Sarah's Quilts had promised: documentation of financial crimes spanning from 1983 to 1986. Bank statements showing suspicious transactions between multiple accounts, property deeds with inflated valuations, contracts for construction projects that had never been completed, correspondence between Wright and several other Portland businessmen discussing the movement of funds through various shell corporations. The evidence was comprehensive and damning, a complete record of a sophisticated money laundering operation that had used real estate development as its cover. But the documents also revealed something more personal and more dangerous. Sarah Mitchell's name appeared throughout the files. She had maintained the books for Wright Development until January 1986. Her signature-verified transactions, she had later come to understand, were fraudulent. Notes in her handwriting documented concerns about discrepancies she had discovered. A letter dated February 1986, addressed to Wright but apparently never sent, outlined what she had found and requested a meeting to discuss her resignation and assurances that she would not face legal consequences for her unwitting participation. The picture became clear. Sarah had stumbled into knowledge that threatened powerful people. She had tried to extract herself safely, but her very awareness of the crimes made her a liability. The quilts had been her insurance policy, a way to document everything she knew in a form that would not immediately endanger her. Yet that protection had ultimately failed. The second excavation site was located 15 feet from the first, in an area that had once been the barn's northwest corner. As investigators dug deeper, the mood at the site shifted from professional focus to somber recognition. At approximately 4 feet below the surface, they encountered remains that forensic anthropologists immediately identified as human. The excavation proceeded with extreme care. Over the next 6 hours, a complete skeleton was recovered along with fragments of clothing and personal effects that had survived decomposition. A leather watch band, metal buttons, the remnants of what appeared to be a wedding ring, and most significantly, a small metal locket that, when carefully opened, contained a faded photograph of a man in construction worker attire. Dental records comparison took only 48 hours to confirm what everyone already understood. The remains belonged to Sarah Mitchell, missing since March 1986. The forensic examination determined that she had suffered blunt force trauma to the skull, the injury consistent with a fatal blow. Time of death could not be precisely determined after so many years, but the location of the burial, the condition of the remains, and the documentary evidence found nearby all pointed to the same conclusion. Sarah Mitchell had been killed shortly after her disappearance, and her body had been concealed on property controlled by the very man whose crimes she had discovered. News of the discovery spread rapidly through law enforcement channels and eventually to the media. The story of the quilt shop owner, who had encoded evidence of her own murder investigation into textile art, captured public attention. But for investigators, the discovery raised an immediate and pressing question. Thomas Wright would now be 89 years old if he was still alive. Could a man nearly 4 decades removed from his alleged crime still be held accountable for what the earth and the quilts had revealed? The answer to that question would determine whether Sarah Mitchell's extraordinary courage and foresight would finally result in justice, or whether too much time had passed for the law to reach across the years and deliver consequences for a crime that had remained hidden for more than a generation. September 2023. The investigation into Thomas Wright moved with remarkable speed given the age of the case. Modern forensic techniques applied to the physical evidence recovered from the burial site, combined with the documentary proof found in the metal container and the decoded information from Sarah Mitchell's quilts, created a comprehensive picture of events from March 1986. Records showed that Wright, now 89 years old, had remained in Oregon throughout the intervening decades. He had retired from active business management in 1995, selling off most of his property holdings and living comfortably on investments that had, ironically, been legitimately acquired in later years. He resided in an assisted living facility in Lake Oswego, an affluent Portland suburb, where he was known as a quiet resident who rarely received visitors. The Clackamas County District Attorney's Office reviewed the evidence and made the determination to proceed with criminal charges. The physical evidence, while aged, was sufficient to establish that Sarah Mitchell had been buried on Wright's property. The financial documents proved motive by demonstrating that Sarah had possessed knowledge capable of destroying Wright's business and reputation. Most remarkably, the quilts provided a contemporaneous record of Sarah's growing fear and her attempts to document the danger she faced. On September 15, 2023, Thomas Wright was arrested at his care facility. The scene was somber rather than dramatic. The elderly man, now using a wheelchair and showing signs of cognitive decline, was transported to the Clackamas County Jail, where he was formally charged with second-degree murder, evidence tampering, and multiple counts of financial fraud related to the original money laundering scheme. The investigation also identified 2 other individuals who had been part of Wright's criminal enterprise in the 1980s. Both men had died years earlier, one in 2003 and another in 2011, taking whatever direct knowledge they had of Sarah Mitchell's death to their graves. Wright's attorney immediately began building a defense based on his client's age and mental condition, arguing that dementia made him incompetent to stand trial. The legal proceedings stretched through the fall of 2023. Medical evaluations of Wright's cognitive function produced conflicting results. The defense emphasized his memory difficulties and confusion about recent events. The prosecution countered that Wright retained clear memories of his business activities from the 1980s and showed no impairment when discussing that period of his life. The judge ultimately ruled that Wright was competent to stand trial, though accommodations would be made for his physical limitations. The trial began in January 2024. The prosecution presented the evidence systematically. The financial documents establishing Wright's criminal enterprise, Sarah Mitchell's role in discovering the fraud, the encoded testimony in her quilts, and the physical evidence from the burial site. Dr. Jennifer Hayes testified about her analysis of the quilt patterns, explaining to the jury how Sarah had created a form of documentation that had survived precisely because no one had recognized it as evidence. The defense strategy focused on reasonable doubt regarding who had actually harmed Sarah Mitchell. Wright's attorney argued that while his client had certainly committed financial crimes in the 1980s, crimes for which he expressed remorse, there was no direct evidence placing him at the scene of Sarah's death. The burial on his property could have been carried out by his business partners without his knowledge. The quilts, while remarkable, were interpretations rather than direct testimony. The jury deliberated for 3 days. On February 8, 2024, they returned a verdict: guilty of second-degree murder and guilty on all fraud-related charges. The courtroom remained quiet as the verdict was read. Thomas Wright showed no visible reaction, staring straight ahead as the judge thanked the jury for their service. Sentencing took place 3 weeks later. Given Wright's age and the likelihood that he had only months or years remaining, the judge handed down a sentence of life imprisonment without possibility of parole. Wright would spend whatever time he had left in the medical unit of a state correctional facility, a stark ending for a man who had evaded justice for 38 years. The resolution of Sarah Mitchell's case brought closure to a community that had long forgotten the gentle quilt shop owner who had once taught sewing classes on Hawthorne Boulevard. The original location of Mitchell's Quilts held a memorial service in April 2024, attended by former students, neighbors who remembered Sarah, and individuals who had followed the case through news coverage. Dr. Jennifer Hayes spoke about Sarah's remarkable intelligence and courage, about a woman who had found a way to speak truth, even in the face of mortal danger. Sarah Mitchell's quilts, once scattered among museums and private collections, were reunited for a special exhibition at the Portland Historical Society titled Patterns of Truth, The Sarah Mitchell Story. The display explained not only the artistic merit of the works, but also their role as evidence in a criminal case. Visitors stood in quiet contemplation before the textiles, reading the accompanying explanations of how each color and pattern had carried meaning, how a woman working alone with needle and thread had created testimony that would outlast her own life. The case transformed how some investigators thought about evidence and communication. Sarah's method of encoding information in plain sight demonstrated that truth could survive in unexpected forms, waiting patiently for someone with the knowledge and dedication to decode it. For Dr. Hayes, the experience reinforced her belief that art and information were not separate categories, but deeply intertwined expressions of human experience and understanding. Detective Robert Anderson, present at the sentencing hearing, reflected on the 38 years between Sarah Mitchell's disappearance and the resolution of her case. He had carried those quilt photographs with him through retirement, unable to shake the conviction that they meant something beyond their apparent purpose. The vindication of that instinct brought him satisfaction, though it could never erase the regret that Sarah's message had not been understood in time to save her life. In the end, Sarah Mitchell achieved what she had set out to do in those final frightening weeks of winter 1986. She had preserved the truth. She had created a record that would survive even if she did not. And though justice had been delayed for nearly 4 decades, it had finally arrived, stitched into being by the patient work of a woman who understood that patterns could speak louder than words, and that some stories, once woven into fabric, could never truly be silenced.